having a coffee with the ultra famous Dr. Constantine Sandis, who I'm very excited to have here today because apart from the fact that he's written so many books, and I've got them all here, and they're all on the topic, the things we do and why we do them, explanation of action, character and causation. I can go on and on. He's incredible. Best bit is he's my younger brother. Did not see that coming, did you? So I thought I'd bring him here today because he's got a lot of pearls of wisdom, and he, apart from his own brilliant mind, understands the minds of all these philosophers. Who's your favourite philosopher?
Probably Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Why?
Well, Wittgenstein, he's a bit of the Marmite of philosophy. It's a sort of love him or hate him, and a lot of philosophers hate him because he thought a lot of philosophy was nonsense.
Okay.
So he was very critical of a lot of philosophy.
And I talk a lot about why we don't do certain things, and fear. Fear is number one in an awful lot of, it doesn't matter how you look at it and what the subject matter is. Fear
is quite interesting. I would say sort of fear and greed are the two primary motives behind bad decision making. If you combine them, that's going to be your worst decision ever. I mean, if you manage to, and we've all done it at times, if you manage to sort of be afraid and greedy at the same time, that's not going to be.
Is that a recipe for disaster?
Yeah, and that's regardless of whether it's an act or an omission. I mean, we, as a general rule, we tend to not do things out of fear and do things out of greed. But there's philosophy going all the way back to, say, Bhagavad Gita, in sort of Hindu philosophy, where the very distinction between act and omission is questioned. And that's kind of very important, because if you realize, and it's not easy to realize this, it's easy to realize it when we're sitting here on the sofa talking philosophy, but in the heat of the moment it's very hard to realize that all omissions contain action and all actions contain omission, and that there actually metaphysically is no distinction between the two. Why? Because in not doing one thing, I'm doing something else.
Yeah, it's still an action.
It's an act of not doing something else, or indeed of doing something else. So in not doing one thing, I may be neglecting something, and all actions contain omission as well, because in writing this book I'm not writing some other book. So one way of thinking about whether, if you're trying to decide whether to do something or not, instead of just thinking in terms of doing this or not doing this, flip it. So think of, if I don't do this, what am I doing? So not doing this is doing something else, and then you think, do I want to be doing that other thing? Distinction between doing this particular thing and not doing this particular thing, but there's no distinction between doing and not doing more abstractly.
Okay, yeah.
You can't but act, really. Unless you're in a coma, you are doing.
Okay, now.
But also not doing. You're always.
That's why I need a lot of coffee when I'm around.
And technically, there's always way more things you're not doing than things you are doing, because the number of things you're not doing is infinite.
What's the difference if you had a choice? The doing and the not doing, I get that, but then equally, what if you were faced with two options? How would you go about a choice?
It obviously depends on the option.
And how would Wittgenstein go about a choice?
I'm a kind of particularist about these. So it really depends on the particular choice, and it's often a mistake to have a general. It's fine to have rules of thumb.
Not a Sophie's choice, just a choice.
Rules of thumb are good, but rules where you just go in and just apply the rule blindly without looking at the particulars of your choice, those things tend to
do you think it is based on the actual choice? So does it matter what that choice is, or is it all choices? Is there a tool for choices?
It matters what the choice is. There are tips like flipping it and so on. There are rules of thumb like think about your motive. Is your motive selfishness? Is it greed? Is it fear? Is it anxiety? Is it, what is it? Is it a desire of some kind?
That's,
or is it,
that's the route that I would normally go
so that
under.
these are incredibly good rules of thumb.
Yeah.
But the reason why I don't want to say it's a general rule is that if you see someone, just take an extreme example, but you see someone screaming with pain and you run to them to help them, that is not a good time to stop and think, why am I doing this? Is it because I want to be a hero?
I should then narrow down, okay, maybe not a specific question, but what if it's a choice that you have to make, that you have time to think about, because it's maybe a life-changing choice. You've got options. So there are good and bad things for both. Is there a way? Or is it by nature, because you are a philosopher, that you just philosophize about it?
No, not at all. So for example,
I
some
have visions
people,
of you going to the supermarket and being able to choose, because you just have a little philosophical
that can happen.
debate.
In fact, there's a famous the philosopher John Buridan had a donkey, and the donkey he has this example. So we call the example Buridan's ass, but it's about his donkey, not his posterior, and so he's got these two identical hays of straw, and Buridan says this donkey will starve because it can't decide which one is better.
Okay.
And so it can't eat either of them. So the idea is that we're looking for the thing that distinguishes it. So if you're trying to decide which film to want, you're looking for
what's the advantage of the
if
one
it all
option.
looks identical, then you struggle to make a decision, and you might just flip a coin. Obviously you're not going to stop, but you might think, I might as well flip a coin. Who cares? One thing that's interesting, for example, is if you go to like a supermarket and there's a new brand of marmalade.
Yeah.
Not marmalade, jam. There's a new brand of jam. And you think, I want to try this new brand of jam.
Yes.
And it's got like blueberry and raspberry. And you think, should I get the blueberry or the raspberry? And you think, I'll get both. Why not get both? You're excited. You're about to get both.
Yeah.
And then you see, oh, there's also apricot and strawberry, and cherry. And then you can't get all of them because you're like, I'm not going to spend like £50.
Yeah.
Then what if the jam?
Yeah.
And what do most people do at that point? They get nothing. They're overwhelmed, and then they just get the one they normally get.
Okay.
Whereas if there was one or two even, you might get both.
Okay.
And now some people, if you've
so you
got,
go back to the familiar, because I talk about the familiar plays a very
go back to the familiar.
Do you think that the familiar is something that we are wired or taught?
I mean, most things. This is called the nature-nurture debate.
Yes.
So if you think it's human nature or maybe animal nature more generally, then you think it's wired. If you think it's nurture, then
what do you
it's
think?
it's somehow taught. Now, as a general rule,
and this will be very interesting because be careful what you answer.
Well, as a general rule, whenever people have the nature-nurture debate, the answer is always it's a mix. So it's a mistake to think it's 100% either. That said, with some things, it may be a lot more of one than the other. So like familiarity sounds like something where that's a good sort of candidate for something that's innate, for something that's not nurture, that's kind of wired into us in a way. That seems like a good candidate because it's not quite clear how you teach familiarity, right? There's a lot of things we teach. There are a lot of things that vary from person to person, family to family, culture to culture, one period to another. Familiarity seems to be there across all cultures and times. So that's a good candidate for being wired or part of our nature. Even animals, even my cats, familiarity. I move them to a different space, they freak out. But less true of my dog. Familiarity, she doesn't need.
They live a little bit more in the moment, so I wonder how much of that is habit.
Dogs and
how
wolves
much of it...
don't need half as much family. She likes some routine, but she doesn't need half as much familiarity as a cat, which will really freak out if I put it in a stranger's home.
Yeah.
Unlike my dog, so that seems to be like differences, and it's not culture, it's nature, but differences from one species to another.
I mean, you and I, we've grown up in the exact same environment. It does make me laugh that you've written a book called The Things We Do and Why We Do Them. And
You're writing a book right now.
yeah, and I kind of dealing with the same. The other day I was like, we are so different, and yet here we are, both talking about.
Well, we share 50% of our genes.
Why do we do what we do? Can you summarize that in
Why do we-
one?
I am a pluralist, and pluralists are very hard to summarize. So one thing I do in this book is that I look at what I call reductivist views of action explanation, which is shorthand for why we do the things.
You can forward
do.
that if that.
Reductivist view is like all action is done out of, and then you pick one motive.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, if you're Freud, it's like you want to marry your mom and kill your dad or something. You know,
Yeah.
all action is, you know. So there were these Darwinians who thought everything was survival.
Okay.
Everything is the will
that
to
it's wired in
to,
from
to
the
survive. Everything
yeah.
we do is to survive. This
Okay.
is still a very popular view. Nietzsche, who thought that my second favorite philosopher, and Nietzsche, who thought that was wrong, in a way didn't do much better. He thought it was all power. It's all the will to power. So it was all about, it was not just survival, it's about having power. So I call these reductivist views, and I think pluralism says, well,
a little bit of that, a little bit of that.
not necessarily. Sometimes it might be all of this, and other times all of that.
Okay.
Sometimes it can be a mix, for sure. But it's a mistake to think, so there's a, you know, it's always desire. It's always because we think it's the right thing. That was Plato's view. Plato was highly optimistic about human nature. He thought we always do what we think is best. It's just we're often wrong about it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, did you have a moment where you thought, this is my belief, or did you go in with a different belief, and then as you studied? Because I always find it very fascinating. Sometimes we don't know why we do things, we just do them. Okay, then when you normally when you hit a bit of hot water, you just kind of go, okay, let me analyze why I'm in this situation. And it is sad that actually we have to look at how we feel and what we process when the times are hard. We don't sort of sit there, have a nice cup of coffee and go, oh, I know, today I'm gonna, well, you might, but most people don't sit around going, I wonder why I do that. Why did I think that way? Why did I put myself in this position? So do you think that you changed? I always find it really fascinating to find out what the thought process is. Did you kind of study an awful lot of different things and then go, actually, now I think like so? Or did you go in with a certain thing and kind of just looked for evidence to support what you...
No, it was
what you
definitely
feel?
the former. I
Yeah.
definitely, my mind changed quite a lot during the writing of this book. I spent many, that was my first book. I spent a long time, because I also did doctoral research before
Yeah.
on this topic. So this was something where, you know, I was interested in the question, and then I would read different people's answers and think about them. I wasn't like I had a hunch and then I tried to prove that my hunch
It's an
was
extraordinary field
So,
to...
You know, sometimes people have a hypothesis and they go out and test it, and that's fine, though we are often biased towards evidence that would support our hypothesis. But this wasn't like that. And what I was interested in was that there were people doing this in psychology. There were people doing it in neuroscience. There were people doing it in physiology. There were people doing it in philosophy. But even within philosophy, there were people doing it in so-called philosophy of mind, in philosophy of action, and then in ethics. And these people were hardly talking to one another. So you'd have this like radically different views of why we do things. And it wasn't even clear they were always seeking to explain the same thing. Because if I'm a physiologist, what I care about is why my muscles contract and why my arm moves. I'm not necessarily caring about motives. I'm caring about sort of signals within the body. And if I'm a neuroscientist, I'm looking at things in the brain, looking at patterns and correlation, but I'm not necessarily looking at childhood motives and trauma, which is what I'm doing when I'm a psychologist. And if I'm a philosopher, what I'm interested is in things like, what is belief, what is desire, what is it to act against your own better judgment? Can that be possible? How could someone do something that they think isn't the thing they should do? Or do we always in the moment think this is the right thing and only later realize that
it's like putting all of the different theories and approaches
Yeah.
and then looking at the umbrella, which actually is what I do a little bit as well. Like I like,
Yeah.
I'm not one of these people that will say this is the only thing, because as you know, I'm interested in helping people release emotional pain. Now, how you do that, there's so many different methods, and I've studied different things, and again, as you know, it came from a place where I needed to feel, to release emotional pain for myself, and then you go out on this quest to see what it, and is there just one approach? I don't believe there is, and I think
it's important to have, so for example, you've specialized in certain particular approaches and techniques, and I think it's important to have that specialty, because you need to know one approach inside out. The mistake then happens if one ignores all other approaches. So what you need to do is you want to be a kind of jack of all trades, but you've also got to be like a king of one. So because then that gives you the kind of deep understanding of what it is to have an approach, what it is to be, and we all may come from different schools of thought, different practices, and so on. So it's important to, in a way, have both. So you're not just like, you just read everything and then you're confused and you think it's all good. When you've got an approach, you've got something from which to criticize other approaches and to say sometimes mine is right and this is why. But the mistake is to let that become ideology and ignore insights from other approaches.
And also with my approach, it's also quite evidence-based, because I obviously need to see the evidence of what it is that works.
Philosophers, we're not evidence-based?
Have you come to a conclusion? If you were to conclude,
there's so many things.
I feel like we should make this like a monthly thing where we talk about all these amazing...
One thing I wanted to talk about causation, and we'll end on this.
Yes.
Cause
I'm
and
going to
effect.
have you back.
Cause and effect. Sometimes it seems obvious what is cause and what is effect, and we think, this thing destroyed this aspect of my life, or ruined my marriage, or made me leave my job, or whatever. But sometimes, we get tricked. The brain, as you would put it, would trick us, and actually that was an effect of something that was already going wrong in your home life, in your work life, whatever, and the thing that you think triggered the big thing was actually almost a symptom of, and certainly wouldn't have had that effect had the other thing been okay. And on that note, next time what we should talk about is triggering and structuring causes, because people often think, what was the cause? And actually there's a philosopher called Fred Dretske, no longer alive, bless his soul, very sweet man, southern gentleman, who distinguished between triggering and structuring causes. And he says that for every piece of behavior, for every action, there's the thing that triggered it, but it only triggered it because a certain structure was already present. And if so something may trigger you because of a past trauma. But the trauma is the structuring cause, and the event that just happened is the triggering cause. But it's a mistake to think which of these two is the real cause. They come together,
and it is important to distinguish that, because also when we're trying to release the emotional pain, it makes a very big difference to understand. I always like working backwards, because then you can't solve something that you can't understand where it's coming
from. So I want to end on this note, that it's a mistake to think to look for the real reason, the real cause, because different factors come together, and which one of them may be the most important in terms of your release, in terms of what you need, but you need to understand how the other factors come into play.
Because I talk about being a detective. Whenever a problem presents itself, you need to be a detective, and you need to peel the layers and go and see what all the different things are.
We've come full circle. This is the best thing to end on, because my favorite philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a big fan of detective novels and detective fiction, and even some films. He was a bit of he'd like to go to the cinema as well. His main book, my favorite, he has two books, one published within his lifetime and one posthumously, and loads of other writings, is Philosophical Investigations. And that title comes because he thinks philosophy is detective work. And he got that title because of his love of detective work, and he thinks this is what philosophers do. We are detective, we investigate.
I love that.
So we're back where we started.
Wow, cheers to that, and let's do more of this.
Have a good morning, everyone.
Bye.
these things can happen as well. For example, I might purchase a very high insurance out of fear, for example. So these things can happen. Another thing that's very interesting is we talk of act and omission, but a sort of, so omission, by omission I mean not doing something.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm ego trapped and I'm worried about if I fail, so I don't do something because if I don't do it, I'll
Yeah.
never fail.
Yeah.